it's something that has become very transparent as a result of lockdown and the pandemic, that the impact has been very unequal, and many of these inequalities are spatial inequalities and inequalities in access to all kinds of amenity, and also the kinds of resources that people have for dealing with a crisis like this. So that was one starting point. And oh no, it's jumped about. Andy, I don't know if you can come to the, wait a minute. All right, okay. The second starting point was the idea that, sorry, this is jumping around. I don't know quite why it is. That we have to consider how futures are being formulated. And in a lot of the time, people who are living from day to day, whose basic horizon is being able to pay the rent at the end of the week, it's very difficult if you start asking questions about, well, what kind of city would you like to live in? What kind of neighborhood would you like to live in? What kind of urban future can you imagine? It's very difficult for them to actually step back from the sheer grind of everyday living to consider some of those impacts. And although for some people, more privileged people, the lockdown has perhaps created a space in which some of those issues have been able to be considered, for a lot of people, it's really been the opposite. So that was another starting point. The visions of the future that we're often presented certainly don't take into account many of those inequalities, or if they do, they attempt to create a kind of rather top-down technological fix for them. So this is the Crystal. It's an exhibition center in the Royal Docks that was designed by Siemens, and if you go in there, you can all sorts of wonders unfold in terms of how the smart city is going to fix almost everything from racism and unemployment and whatever. So that's one sort of dominant sort of view of the future. This is the hoarding around the International Business Centre at Stratford, and that's another vision of what our future is to become. Then there's the consumer city. And this whole exhortation that that we should live the dream, we should this dream time, which is tomorrow. So these are some of the images that children and young people are kind of being fed. There are, of course, alternative dreams, alternative futures. The green city, notion of a people's city, city in which is governed by more direct forms of direct democracy, and then there's the child-friendly city that we're going to be talking about quite a bit this evening. So there are these alternative visions, and there are also what young people themselves are doing in terms of reclaiming the streets, in terms of their relationship to the environment, and challenging some of the more rigid, sort of planified versions of what the city is about and who it's for. This was a map that inspired us at the beginning. It basically tells the story of the shrinkage of the space of childhood over several generations. So it's a map from a project that was done in Rotherham. And so the great-grandfather is allowed to walk 6 miles to go fishing. The grandfather, who was age 80 in 1950, he can walk 1 mile on his own to the woods. And then if you go to the top, his mother was only allowed to walk to the swimming pool alone 1/2 mile away, and his son, who's now aged 8, is only allowed to walk on his own to the end of his street. So that the right to roam and the has been collapsed, really. And of course, the whole kind of moral panics about the dangers and so on about this. But I think we have to consider that that this is indeed what is happening, and sometimes the space of childhood is shrunk to the confines of the bedroom. Of course, you've got the right to roam through your phone, digital roaming, but not to actually go out on the street and navigate the environment. So the Young Citizens Atlas, what is it? It's an online platform. It consists of a toolkit of resources. It's centered around participatory methods of map making with children and young people, something that the members of our team have been developing in various ways, as you'll see shortly, for quite some time. We are looking at urban issues, but only the issues so far as they emerge from children's own activities, own map making, and the other exercises that we do. We're not imposing an agenda on them. It's something that emerges from the map works that they're doing. And unlike an atlas, which is a sort of a rather static, it's a collection of maps, paper maps. It's not that kind of atlas at all. It's an evolving framework, ones that will change, hopefully, over time. Well, why now? Well, I've probably perhaps dealt with that to some extent. Obviously, we have to deal with the negative impact of lockdown and the pandemic. The way in which children and young people are excluded from debate and decision-making about the future of cities, and the urgent need to empower them in tackling the environmental and climate crisis. So the toolkit consists of 6 units or modules, each exploring a different issue. The approach is to combine map making with fieldwork, with observational exercises, with actually going out. It's not all based in the classroom. It's about going out into the city and conducting various sorts of activities. We'll be providing online training and support for teachers and youth workers from our team. And there are also a number of artists in our team who will be going into the schools, into the youth centres, and working alongside the staff in developing the project and in helping to curate the map works that the children produce into an exhibition, which will both be online and on site. So these are the 6 themes that we're addressing. The first one, which I think Giada might say a bit about, Giada Patel might say a little bit about later on, is a kind of introductory one, looking at actually, what is a map, what does it do, what's it for, who's it for, and what kinds of mapping will be involved in this particular project. The second one is reinventing the high street. Obviously, it's addressing the question that, not just because of the pandemic, but the whole notion of the high street is changing, and it is opening up possibilities for new ways of thinking about what high streets are for. Natalie Eldridge is going to join us in a minute to talk a bit about, she's working on that bit of the project. There's a module looking at environmental hazards, a kind of 2 maps, one in which there's lots of hazards and one in which there aren't so many, and there's a kind of I Spy exercise of going out into the environment and actually recording various kinds of environmental hazards in the environment. Fourth one is looking at youth culture in terms of the kinds of consumer goods that mobile phones and sneakers and so on, and it's mainly these are for like a teenage group. Most of the modules are for 8 to 14-year-olds. But this one is for a slightly older age group, where they'll be doing kind of research into how these items are made, what kinds of raw materials are used, the labor conditions, and making a map showing where they all come from and how they're made, and considering more kind of ethical ways, perhaps, of producing and distributing these items. Are We That Place name? It's again with a slightly older age group, looking at the names of places and buildings in their immediate neighborhood and environment. Who gets to put their names on streets and buildings? What kind of history does that tell? And then they'll be making an alternative. They'll be making a map telling some of that history, but also thinking about renaming places so that they reflect more contemporary values and cultures than a lot of them do. So that's about decolonizing urban space. And finally, the final module is exploring the child-friendly city. And again, I think two of our contributors will be addressing that in a minute. So just to give you a sort of taster of how we're approaching this, I'm going to ask Natalie Eldred, who's been working on this project, to come in and actually talk a bit about it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Natalie?
Yeah. Hello.
Yes. Do you want to come and say a bit about this particular bit of the project?
Yes, sure. I'll just share my screen as well. But initially, I'd like to say that the image you just saw was I'm going to show you some work in progress on what is called the Miriorama aspect of the High Street project. Just in case, I'm going to take it for example. Tell you what Miriorama is. I'm sorry if some of you know already, but it was I feel you can stop me if I'm wrong there, but that it's a Victorian kind of parlor game where you have any number of cards with illustrations on them that you can switch around, and they will, whatever way you switch them, wherever you place the cards, whichever order, they will always still make sense, and they'll make an image. So the brief that Phil's given me for the Young Citizens Atlas is to do a high street in a Miriorama format, which you'll see in a minute has some challenges. Bear with me a second. I just press the right button. So I'm now sharing my screen. I need to show you the cards. They're in the under here, under this thing. Give me a second. There we are. Right, I'll see if I can. There's all these things in the way. Okay, I need to get rid of this time, don't I? Really? Minimize that. Okay, so can you all see that? Okay, so yeah, so this is several cards, and this is just a work in progress at the moment. The main constraint of a Miriorama is that all the cards have to be able to line up and have to work. And traditionally, most Mirioramas you'll see, if you do some research into it, would be landscapes, really. And landscapes, the constraint obviously is that you have a kind of foreground, a midground, and a background. And that works quite well with a landscape because you can have events happening, people walking through the landscape any way you like within a card. And you know, a landscape can join up fairly fluidly. It's a bit more challenging in an urban environment. But what I've done, I mean, this is some time ago we last worked on this, but I've been traveling around the UK by Google Maps, not actually traveling, but looking at high streets in London, Cambridge, Brentwood, various places. I need to go up north a bit as well and have a look around to try and make a generic sort of British high street, which has a certain amount of realism, but also provides a kind of space for children to work with. So I think the main part of the brief that Phil mentioned was to show the high street changing through time, to show different kind of spaces, like for example your kind of gentrified areas, your more run down areas, perhaps public spaces like youth centres or libraries. If I go a bit closer to some of this, or you can see. So I've experimented with different ways of doing it. Now, there's quite a few challenges because it's an urban space and because you've got perspective going on. I've had to sort of be a bit liberal with use of perspective. So you have things like this happening in the middle of cards. I haven't really worked out if I'm going to have one high street shop per card or 2 or 3. I think it varies really, but as long as there's a kind of roof line, they kind of make sense. These are quite realistic examples. There are some other examples here. I'll pull this down a second and just show you some other examples of cards where there's a kind of suggested background going on. There's a high street, there's a pavement space where people can do things, and then there's a lamppost or various bits of furniture. I'll show you a couple of others. So there's a couple of elements that I think are possibly slightly in conflict at the moment, in that I need to know if the brief is mostly about showing urban spaces, architectural spaces, or whether it's about some narrative elements, because we've discussed narrative elements coming into it. This is something that Phil suggested, a diver coming up through a hole in the ground. Maybe things like, say, for example, a balloon, a child holding a balloon, a child in a pram holding a balloon in one, and then that balloon having taken off and being in the sky in another one. So there are narrative elements in the, you know, maybe an apple rolling off of a greengrocer's stall. And this presents challenges for the amount of detail that you can contain on the card. So there's a couple of things that still need to be resolved, like how large these cards are going to be when they're printed and they're used in schools, whether they're going to be quite small, how much space will be devoted to sort of people and the usage of the space, and how much will be devoted more to architectural spaces. And I think I've just stopped sharing, have I? I didn't mean to press that red button.
All right.
But you maybe saw enough there. I think I don't want to go on for too long because I know you've probably more that you need to say, Phil. But yeah, I've been doing a lot of research, and it's work in progress. I think it's a lovely way for children to work with it. So
great, thank you, Natalie. Yes, so one of the is obviously children will be going out, you know, visiting their local high street, maybe doing interviewing people there, the shopkeepers, and so on and so forth, and making a kind of little study of it. But I think, as Natalie said, one of the points of using these cards and the Miriam is to spark off narratives. So some of the narratives could be quite realistic, but sometimes also kind of fantasy kind of elements. So to really kind of encourage children and young people's imagination of the high street, and they might then you know, also draw their own versions of it. So it encourages them to do that as well. So Natalie, you something you wanted to add?
Well, I forgot to mention that bit, that there'll be some blank cards. I mean, they're going to be quite simple for me to do in a way, because they'll just be hints at where the high street might be, just so they fit in together. But yes, mostly blank, so that children can do their own work on there. It's a big, important part of it, wasn't it?
Yep, yeah. Okay, well, I'm nearly done. What I want to do is just finish by showing you a clip from a short video we made about the Citizens Atlas. And I just want to play a bit which just illustrates the different approaches to map making that we're going to be using in the project. So hopefully this will work.
Phil, we are not hearing the sound of the video.
Oh, right, okay.
So probably you should stop sharing and then restart.
Yes. Okay, sorry. I'm not quite sure what to do about that.
It may be because you have headphones on. So
oh.
if you're...
Well, okay. Hold on. I don't seem to be able to do this. Andy, are you there? Do you think you could or maybe we'll just move on.
We can see your screen now, Phil.
Yes, but I can't. How do I get the sound?
Try playing again if you've taken your headphones out.
Okay, I'll take my head. Try now. Okay.
Is a type of life map.
Yes, we can hear.
Situates people's
sound advice there. Thank you.
And lifetimes on a piece of paper. And it's a method of interviewing immigrants who lives as a minority in London. The map itself starts very personal, but then it finishes as very global issues.
Just Map is very much about collaborative, co-produced mapping. So we have a simple recording system with a number on the flag, and someone puts the flag on the map and writes on our recording sheet the place or the issue that they want to map. And it's a very flexible methodology as well, because it can be used around any kind of theme. We've done maps around neighbourhood planning, but also things that are slightly more cultural in a sense.
In London, there were huge amounts of demolition work going on, huge amounts of construction work, and with no clear idea of where these were coming from or who had control over these issues, certainly not us. And we thought it would be interesting to take a map and sort of invite people to make those decisions, to sort of let their imagination flow. And actually, by giving them like a tool to cut that thing off the map that they wanted to cut off. And at the end of the session, we left with people's loves and hates and feelings about their urban environment and feelings about their experiences in that environment.
We've been doing some pilot work with different groups of people to try out different ways of working, different working processes. And the idea now is to sort of expand that and spread that around and pass those working processes on to other people who we can work with and bring together different voices and different neighbourhood views about what's happening in London, so that each neighbourhood can strengthen what it's saying and what other neighbourhoods are saying.
Right, so
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, so I think I'll just give you an idea of the kind of range of different approaches to mapping that we're hoping to use. So now, so that's a bit of the sort of background to it, if you like. And now I'd like to ask Giada Patel, who's been working on one particular module, but has also been doing lots of other kinds of work involving educational projects with young people. And she's has this amazing combination of being a geographer and a cartoonist, and has done a lot of work about how those two disciplines can work with each other. So Giada, hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. So hope you can see it. And does the slide, does the slide change? Yes, okay, good. So good evening, everyone. And before I start, I would like to say that I am here today on behalf of a broader group working on a specific part, as Phil said, of the Young Citizen Atlas of London. So together with my colleagues, Mike Duggan and Amy Mulvenna in particular, we have been working on a part of the toolkit that uses verbal visual language as an educational tool. I will come back to this toolkit in the final part of my presentation, but before doing so, as Phil anticipated, I would like to briefly introduce myself and focus on my specific contribution to the team from the perspective of both a geographer and cartoonist. In fact, in my presentation, in the first part of my presentation, I will focus on the prolific use of cartographics as educational tools, presenting a couple of empirical examples of projects and educational projects with young people on which I have been working in the past years and that inform my contribution to the Atlas. As a cultural geographer with a background in literary studies, I've approached cultural cartography from a narrative angle. So in my research, I've been working on the entanglements between stories and maps, on how stories represent and integrate maps, but also on how maps are able to tell stories. Furthermore, I've been engaging with maps also as a comic author, fascinated by the interconnections between maps and the verbo-visual grammar of comics. Rather than simply focusing on the representation of maps in comics, I've tried to understand what comics and maps have in common, and in what way graphic narratives could take part in the theoretical reflection about maps. So this is where the cartographic essay in the form of a 5-page comic story published in 2019 by the Livingmaps Review comes from, that you can see here on this slide. Yet, how do these theoretical reflections interact with the idea of maps and illustrations as educational tools? I believe that cartographics, namely the combination of maps and graphic narratives, have huge potentialities as educational tools. Cartographics can prompt the active participation of young readers through a playful verbo-visual language. They can explain complex topics, making them more accessible through visualizations. Finally, they can stimulate readers' own creative imaginations. To make my point, I will provide you with a couple of examples that helped me to imagine how to use cartographics for the Young Citizens Atlas of London. So the first project is an illustrated book titled La Geografia Spiegata ai Bambini, namely translated in English here at the moment as Geography Explained to Children, that I have written and drawn myself for the publishing house Becco Giallo in 2020. The book was funded by the Italian Association of Geography Teachers, the AEEG, and realized with the scientific collaboration of the Museum of Geography of the University of Padova. In short, the protagonist of the book is Alex, a young girl who, thanks to her friend, Mr. Globe, discovers the adventurous side of geography. The book creatively explains key geographical concepts like place, landscapes, borders, climate change, and maps, of course. The story is accompanied by more than 20 original illustrations that include portraits of well-known geographers that Alex meets along the path, like from example, Alexander von Humboldt or Lorraine Massey, and also a series of objects selected from the collection of the Museum of Geography. Some of these objects have even become characters, like the huge globe preserved at the Museum of Geography of the University of Padova. As you can see in this slide, the 3-dimensional globe shown in the photo on the background has become an animated character in the story named Mr. Globe. When writing the book, I asked myself, how can we help a young audience to understand the processes of reduction, symbolization, and representation of a map? The visual metaphor of a flat carpet seemed an easy way to visualize the complexities of the cartographic process. This playful, through illustration, the flat map turns into a soft blanket that envelopes the body of Alex, bringing the image of a voluminous 3-dimensional mountain back to life. So this playful attitude doesn't simply help to represent complex concepts through more accessible visualization. It further contributes to engage children in a process of self-awareness, where the force of imagination activates a sense of empowerment. For example, in this illustration about borders, Alex uses the simple gesture of coloring the map of Europe with a single green color to represent the dream of an ideal world without borders. Funded by a National Association of Geography Teachers, the illustrated book was designed as both an easy reading for young people, but also as an educational tool for teachers. Therefore, I organize both training courses for teachers and educational laboratories for kids based on the illustrated book. Given the pandemic situation, most of these laboratories took place in different parts in the city of Padua, in Italy, during summer 2021. As you can see from this picture, my audience was composed of kids of different ages, from 3 to 12 years old. Each laboratory is based on a narrative approach and starts with my narrative voice introducing the main character, Alexer, and her adventures to the audience. The narrative approach aims to bring kids to empathize with the protagonist of the story. So in this way, they are more keen to engage with the proposed activities to imitate their new heroine. The second part of the laboratory comprises a set of cartographic activities and observational exercises to learn how maps work, how to locate ourselves in space and on the map, and how to integrate a map when it forgets to represent spatial features that we consider relevant. Yes. Here on this slide, you can see two illustrated maps of two different parts of Padova I drew for the laboratories. Despite their differences, they have many common features. For example, Alex appears on each map so that I can tell kids that she's the actual author of the map. In this way, their tasks seem to be directly assigned by the protagonist of the story. The title on the maps, My Park, the Park That I Desire, translated from Italian, refers to the double perspective I want kids to engage with. My park is the park that they inhabit and see. The park that I desire is the empty space on the map that they can fill in with their cartographic imaginations. These maps are never presented as ready-made objects. Rather, they are emerging practices, and kids are constantly asked to integrate the map, planning the future park. In this way, their creative imagination become part of the mapping process, turning maps into objects of desire, resignification, and belonging. In the end, maps become a place where spatial dreams come true. In the final part of the cartographic laboratory, I work with maps as storytelling devices. All participants are invited to present their map to the audience, sharing their ideas and choices, emotions and desires. This storytelling process allows to activate a collective mapping process that stimulates a sense of community and permits to recognize that the same park has different inhabitants that can draw different maps. The second project that I will just briefly introduce is titled Inventiamo il paesaggio, a play on words that in Italian means let's invent the future landscape, but also we love our present landscape. Launched in 2020, the project aimed at celebrating the 20th anniversary of the European Landscapes Convention, promoting a series of interconnected activities to disseminate its contents. This comprised a website, a training course for teachers, the print and distribution of an illustrated booklet on the European Landscape Convention, and the launch of a challenge to all the second classes of the secondary school of the Veneto region. So in this presentation, I will focus only on the booklet and the challenge because they really inspired also the way in which we designed with Mike and Amy our part of the toolkit. The booklet was printed in thousands of copies and distributed in all the secondary schools of the Veneto region, but it is also available on the project's website for free download. It is composed of almost 20 pages, but its core is made of 4 double pages, and each of them contains, as you can see here, a series of keywords, a short text explaining a section of the European Landscape Convention in an easier language, and a box with suggested actions and educational activities, and finally, of course, original illustrations. These illustrations do not serve a merely decorative function, rather they integrate text, visualize key concepts, capture readers' attention, and stimulate their own observation and creativity through the combined use of words and images. The project didn't want to simply propose a passive reading of the European Landscape Convention. On the contrary, our goal was to stimulate participants' sense of belonging, stimulating the practice of taking care of the ordinary landscape they inhabit, just as the Young Citizen Atlas of London would like to do with our city and neighborhood. For this purpose, in October 2020, we launched a challenge to all the second classes of the secondary schools of Veneto, and 55 classes and their teachers took on the challenge. So as you can see on this slide, these projects are mapped on the project's website and gave birth to what we call the map of the landscapes of care of Veneto. Clicking on the pins, we can visualize the project of each class, seeing a picture of the landscape as it was in the first phase of the when the challenge started, and an image, often a collage or a drawing or a very creative interaction with the landscape, showing how kids imagined to transform their ordinary, often urban landscapes in the second phase of the project. So the map of the landscapes of care represents both a live record of ordinary landscapes chosen by young citizens of Veneto region, as well as a lively mapping process that represents their hopes and visions of future landscapes. So even if the page is in Italian and the website is in Italian, of course, I invite you to visit the website www.inventiamoilpaesaggio.it to have a look at these amazing projects. I hear some voices, probably someone has, yeah.
So I have
the audio activated, yep, okay, good. So coming to the final part of the project, of my presentation, sorry. Okay, the examples I presented today are meant to help you to visualize what Mike Duggan, Amy Mulven, and I had in mind when we started drafting an idea of a verbo-visual toolkit for the Young Citizen Atlas of London. Each of us contributes to the team with a different expertise. Dr. Amy Mulvenna holds a PhD in geography and worked on creative participatory mapping practices with children. Recently, Amy has taken on the role of head of art at Charles Dickens Primary School in Southwark, London, and has also set up a free online art education website called London South Art Hub in response to the national lockdown in the UK. Mike Duggan, who many of you already know, is a lecturer in digital culture, society and economy in the Department of Digital Humanities at the King's College of London. And he's also the editor-in-chief of the journal Livingmaps Review, and contributes his expertise as a cultural geographer and critical cartographer to this project. Our toolkit aims to give young people the opportunity to use novel verbo-visual methods to engage with their local spaces and communities, but we also aim to provide teachers with tools they could use in the classroom and outside the classroom to increase young citizens' spatial awareness. In fact, the core of the toolkit is made of a series of original verbo-visual posters that compose an educational path that should should teach students how to observe the neighborhood, to interact with its local community, and to take action to change it. So we plan to make these posters available for free download on the project's website, as well as to organize both laboratories with young people and training sessions with their teachers in order to discuss together the possible uses of the toolkit. The poster that you see on this slide is just a prototype to show you how we are designing the toolkit. So like the posters of Inventiamo il Paesaggio, our posters use cartographics, namely a combination of maps, illustrations, and text to create a more engaging verbo-visual communication. In this case, we decided to present a method, ethnography, suggesting a short definition of it in a text box. Given the intention to turn young citizens' critical thinking into action, the posters do not simply provide users with static definition, but also with a series of exercises by which they should learn through practice. Here, we suggested to use walking as an embodied practice to conduct ethnographic observation in the neighborhood, in combination with other verbo-visual practices like photography, taking notes, and drawing. Take photographs, make sketches of your surrounding, Build a collection of the materials that you find all around you, is our invitation to the reader. The collection of spatial data and the mapping process are represented as spatial adventures, where participants are invited to see the familiar space of the neighborhood and of the city through a renewed lens. The texts in the posters serve different functions. They explain key topics, they question taken for granted perspectives on cities, and finally, the spoken words in the balloons suggest the possibility of a dialogue among inhabitants on the same community and classmates. In these posters, like in cartographics, illustrations are equally important as text. This draft poster, for example, contains a map that invites users to locate themselves in a broader urban space of London, but also to engage creatively with a map of their area. The illustration of a camera helps visualizing some of the objects and tools that should become part of the participants' toolkit. And finally, posters will include portraits of local actors, inhabitants, and researchers to allow young citizens to recognize the members of the local community, but also to reflect on their own positionality as observers. So to conclude, as said, the process of designing the toolkit is still on a very initial stage and has been deeply impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Nevertheless, some fixed points of reference are still guiding our reflections as a team. Mike, Emmy, and I firmly believe that cartographics, the combined use of text, illustrations, and maps, would help us raise young citizens' engagement, capture their attention towards complex urban phenomena, and stimulate their urban imaginations. This approach is both playful and radical, creative and critical, in the firm belief that mapping new urban contexts starts with the drawing of some lines of action. In our view, cartographics represent a useful means of creative empowerment and critical awareness for young citizens. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Giada. Thank you so much for taking us through that. And as Giada mentioned, the impact of lockdown has certainly impacted on the development of this project and caused us to kind of rethink a lot of it. And our next presentation is from Joel Seath, who's been a key member of our team as we've been going forward. Joel is a play worker of many years standing. He currently provides play and classroom support to primary school age children, and he's worked in a variety of play-based environments, including adventure playgrounds, after-school clubs, play schemes, nurseries, outreach, street play, and festivals. He's done a lot. And most recently, he's been working with children in a primary school during the lockdown period. So he's going to talk to us about that project and his observations from it. So Joel, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. Yes, first of all, apologies for, good evening, everyone, by the way. There's a couple of names on this list that I recognise. Good to see those names and good to see names that I don't know yet. My apologies for my gravelly voice, which may come across as a little bit odd at the moment, but as Phil said, I'm working in the school and I'm currently have the pleasure of working with year ones, 5-year-olds, and I've picked up everything this week in terms of all of their bugs. I'm hoping to get through to half term in one piece. I was going to start this, but this is going to be a typically playwork presentation. I've got no flashy slides for you. I've got two drawings that I wanted to show, one of which is regularly popping up for half a second on my screen, so you've probably got a good idea of it by now. I wanted to start this presentation by saying I have a confession to make. My confession is I'm a playworker. I often find that is kind of a defensive stance, but it's kind of bearing fruit at the moment because I found myself to be a playworker in a primary school in the UK, which is rather an old experience. I've been working in primary schools for a couple of years now. The reason I'm saying this is to the playwork literate people on the list at the moment, by which I mean people that have a good understanding or even a vague understanding of playwork. You'll have a good notion of the idea that it's not necessarily the easiest of fits, because playwork is, by way of an introduction, playwork is trying to support the children to play in the way that they want to play and they need to play, rather than in any adult, for want of a better term, dictated way. I can't think of a softer word than that at the moment. Adult agendas, basically. And honestly, it can be a challenge sometimes, because children will want to play in any way that they want to, and any way that they need to, and it doesn't always fit with what the adults in the school would like to do. So that's my starting place. My notes are very playwork. They're on a scrappy bit of paper here, scrappy bit of notebook, so nothing flashy and PDF version. The other thing to say about playwork is it's not about activities. Apologies to people that know what playwork is at the moment. We're not playworkers setting up activities for children to religiously do in a way that the adults want to do. And I think Phil kind of touched on this in a way, in a good, curious sort of way earlier on, when he said it was, I forget what your exact quote was, Phil, but you were sort of alluding to the fact that it's what emerges in the Young Citizens Project, what emerges out of that rather than what is expected. So my work with children in the last couple of years has been with various age groups, and part of it has been over lockdown, whereas to try and find out by observation of their play how they're feeling, basically. It's a very difficult area because we can't always assume that we know what children are doing in their play, but we can, by longitudinal observation, we can have a fairly good educated guess about what's going on and what the children are telling us, not necessarily just by direct communication, but indirectly and through all the meta communications that go on with pretty much everything that happens in children's play. So I've been observing a lot of what the children do over months and months and months and months, and I've got countless observations I could pick out of my head. And the way that I do my mapping, and I use the word loosely, mapping, because it's a very sort of internalized three-dimensional idea, and that I can scan around. I don't know if anyone else listening can do this, maybe you can. You can scan around in your mind's eye a particular area, and you can pick out what's been happening in any particular space at any particular time, not necessarily with an exact date or the datum everything's going on, but you can kind of piece together a 3D version in your head about the play. I'm sorry if that sounds a little bit pretentious and precocious, but that's just the way that my brain works on observation of children's play. Phil just said I've pretty much done it all, but there are two places I've never worked in children's play, and that is supporting children in prisons and hospitals. The latter is a very specialist area, and I wouldn't even go there. I haven't got the skills for that in prisons. That's a completely different story. But everything else I've pretty much done there. So I just want to focus in this presentation about observation of play, because we can assume as adults that we know what's going on, but children will tell you different things. And of all the observational frames of play, and I use the word frames deliberately because it's a playwork word, which I'll come back to in a minute and clarify. Of all the instances of play that's going on, there are some that are quite interesting insofar as the way they develop over the pandemic in the space that I'm working at. For example, building dens. It's a very good one to think about. Set the scene. I'll show you some pretty pictures in a minute. But set the scene, rather a large playing field, quite sizable, good space, surrounded by, on three sides, woodland, which is more or less 6 or 7 meters wide, about 20 feet in Old Penny, all the way around. Lots and lots of opportunities for children to get in there and basically get away from adults' sight. So I've got to be quite careful, because I, as a playworker, know that children go into woods to be away from me, basically. So I've got to walk by and observe and listen and take care not to disrupt the play that's going on. When I said frame, a play frame, what I mean is children will set up by a process of what's known as cues and returns. They'll essentially set up a boundaried space, by which I don't mean necessarily a physically boundaried space, it's a psychologically boundaried space, where the play takes place, it develops, and then it just maybe peters out and then turns into something else. And these frames just tumble over each other all the time. But if you look at it in terms of dens, children's dens, you can see that it's a lot more easy to judge, because you've got pretty much a physically bounded space as well, more or less. I'll come back to dens. I just want to put that in your mind. Let me go back to pictures. If I can work out how to do this share screen. I've got two here. Let me show you this one first. I've changed the names. So I'm calling this a picture by a girl called Ruth. It's not her real name. I worked with the then year 5s, which are 10-year-olds. This is right at the start of the first lockdown in the UK, which was, when was that? March, July 2020, somewhere around there, I think. And through Google Classroom, because a lot of the children were not in school, I was working on a project to work out what they wanted to disclose that they were doing at home. I'm hoping that Ruth, I've chosen this one because I think it's quite self-explanatory. Ruth is a footballer. She's got this massive black road going through the middle of her drawing. And I may have shown this in other presentations before, but I make no apologies for it, because it's a really fascinating moment for me, because I picked up somewhere along the line, and I forget who to credit for this. It may have been Stuart Lester, actually, that these thick black ribbons going through the middle of children's drawings are quite significant. They're barriers in themselves. It was interesting just listening to Jada talk about children's map making, and I was thinking about this at the same time. Ruth's house is very compartmentalized, and she's only got two other things there, which are essentially the same thing. It's nature. That is Ruth's lockdown, which I thought was both beautiful and sad at the same time. I may come back to that one. And just while I'm on children's drawings, I had a whole stack of these, but for obvious reason I can't share them all. This is a boy who I've called Wesley, again year 5, age 10. And his lockdown experience is essentially the big green building in the middle of the school, and the other buildings at the bottom are his street, and he's got this huge enclosure around it, the big black road. And on the perimeters of that, he's got spaces where he's gone. I think the mountains in the left are a trip to Wales, and I interpret the blue and the yellow as a beach, but I'm not entirely sure. And this was interesting on other levels as well, because I remember 6, 7, 8 years ago, I did a similar project in London, and children were drawing, this was in the Shepherd's Bush area in West London, children were drawing very similar thick black lines, because the roads were so dominant, as I interpreted it, in their area. But the difference in the London children's drawings is there was a lot of big red buses and underground trains and the overground trains, and the exact numbers of the bus routes, which I found absolutely fascinating. But you can draw your own conclusions on that. All I'm saying on these drawings is that it was a very direct way of getting children's information on their feelings. Let me just come back to observations. Now, shall I leave that one up there because it's a pretty picture. So coming back to observations, how long have we got, Phil?
Oh, keep going for a few more minutes.
A few more minutes. I've barely even started.
Okay.
All right. Let me buzz it on a little bit. Observations to me are very, very important, because children tell you so much. And going back to the dens idea, when the thing that I gleaned the most out of the original lockdown through these drawings and other information, like children's direct writings on Google Classroom, their direct communications with me, and also observation of their play is, and this will come as no surprise to any of you, I hope, is that they were bored, they were extremely anxious, and they needed friends. They desperately needed their friends. My first observation, before I come back to the dens, is about how children one day, the year 6s, 11-year-olds, approaching the very end of their primary school life, I observed them hugging the trees. And I said to them, and I completely interrupted the play, and I shouldn't have done. I should know better as a play worker, but I was intrigued. I said to them, girls, what's happening? And they said, we're hugging the trees because we can't hug our friends. And it really hit home that that was how they were feeling. And it was no way at all contrived. It's exactly how they felt. And I knew this because additional observations on the last day of term, where they would, bear in mind, they've not been able to spend any time at all. They've been in class bubbles for months. They can only see 14 or 15 of their friends. The other, whatever it is, 45 children in the year group are separated into 3 other bubbles and literally physically separated. And it's heartbreaking. And on the last day of term, I saw that the children were saying, you know what, these rules, we don't care about these rules anymore, we're just going to hug each other. And out they went from the game. So they were desperate for each other's physical contact. And you could see this as well because the field, this is in no way, by the way, my disclaimer, in no way denigrating the school and their policies. They had to do what they had to do through Public Health England. Separate the field into 4 zones, and the children, there's a big wide 3-meter zone in the middle. If you can imagine a big cross, like a crossroads, and the children could play in their own bubbles in their individual zones, but they couldn't reach out and physically touch their friends. So they would literally reach over, even though they had no chance of actually touching, as a sign of saying, we need you. There was one area, however, contradicting what I've just said there, where the zones were roped off down the middle, but there was no exclusion zone down between them. And what happened in the course of time was that the children decided they would subvert the rules. They would not cross the barrier as expected, but they would sit half a circle on one side and half a circle on the other side. So they were in a group circle, much like the pictures on the screen at the moment. The rope went down the middle, much like that was on the screen, and they would have their group chat and they would get as close as they could to physical contact as they were allowed to do. And of course, as time went on, and as we entered the second lockdown, these sort of subversions, for better words, were more and more evident in my play workers' observation. So kicking and streaming back to dens, what I saw in the first lockdown was very, very highly fortified dens, more than usual. I mean, the children build dens all the time, but these were very enclosed spaces with very definitely don't come in here messages all around them, built up with branches. And these dens, over time, they started adapting the actual physical barriers. So the barriers, the cordon would go straight through the main field into the wooded area and at the back fence at the end. And so there was a kind of a border zone, which is absolutely fascinating. So imagine 6 or 7 meters of woodland, more or less unseeable by the adults on the field. The children would observe the border, but they would try to manipulate it to time in terms of moving the cordon, shifting it, using the cordon as weaponizable, kind of like a slingshot. Absolutely fascinating to observe in passing. Going back to the dens, the children started to loosen up their restrictions on themselves until we've got to the present day, and the children's dens are now still evident, but they are much more loose, even though we've had locally, we've had another rise in COVID cases. But the children are not as anxious anymore. In fact, I would say the children are not really anxious at all. It's the adults that are anxious. And in the first case, the adults have passed that anxiety on to the children. So the children's dens now are kind of what I'm calling unenclosures. They're definitely enclosed spaces, but they are very of their own ilk, shall we say. Why am I telling you all this about dens and cities and so forth? Because I believe that through observations of children's play, we can get a good idea of how they operate within the city. Linking into everything I've said, as well as my London observations, is a few years ago I had published in Livingmaps a map I drew of observations of children in my hometown. In terms of, I would walk around and do the same technique, and I remember what would happen, visualize the town as I came along, and draw a map of that. And what I found was fascinating, and it sustains me still, in terms of children's use of edge spaces. And some of the slides that Jada put up, and maybe remember this is why I'm saying this, that children, more or less, they will use the edges to trail on like a little sprite, I suppose. If you can imagine the old, who the listeners are around in the 80s, and the old very, very basic computer games that we used to have in the 80s, and just literally have a little cursor to beep, 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 right around the edge of the screen. And I've seen this in children, and they'll trail around the paving stones, the paving patterns, or around the columns. And of course, they'll be in the central zones as well. But my opinion and observation is that children see these areas as what I term as too live, too visible. And the spaces around the edges, which is why I'm going with the woods and the bends, are much more amenable to children's play. How do we translate? I haven't got an answer to this one at the moment. How do we translate that into city design and future city design and children's opinions through their play coming through? A couple of other things for you in my observations on play. You might think what I'm about to say is not so remarkable, but this is the beauty of playwork observations. You can see the extraordinary in the ordinary. You can see how things that you thought were just, everyone does it, and analyze it to a little bit more depth. In the first lockdown, a year 6 child, she would tell me stories of every day coming into school, and she would just pick up the snails on the floor and take care of them and put them up on the wall so they didn't get trodden on, which I found was kind of beautiful in its own way. And this led into observation in passing of her and her friend, who would build their own spontaneous bug hotels and skyscrapers in the woods, for want of a better term. And one day they were actually heartbroken that the rain had come along and just destroyed it, and they took it and they rebuilt it. But the care and attention to other living animals was quite evident to me in these children's play. Again, how does that translate into the city? Well, I leave you to work out your own conclusions on this one. I have my own conclusions. So I'm going to bore you with it.
Joel, I just have to give you a bit of a time thing here.
Yep, I'll give. How long have I got? 3 minutes? Can I offer you?
Couple of minutes, yeah.
All right. Right. I'm actually close to finishing. Actually, I wanted to draw one more. I raised this in a playbook meeting the other day, and someone said to me, "Well, this is nothing new. This has been going on for years." And I said, "Well, you know, this is new to my locality. So the point of this is that play happens differently and in different phases in different areas. And this is the reenactment of online play in the physical world. And a lot of children, as a lot of people in this arena know, are into Minecraft. I haven't a clue what it is myself, but I know that children do online mining, and they dig out cubes for some reason. Okay. I observed children tapping the wood of the branches with a stick in the same manner as what they told me they were doing in Minecraft. And I thought this was absolutely fascinating, because they're bringing their online adventures into the real world, but in a very nuanced way, in a very unusual way that I'd never seen before. And this has been apparently been going on for a long time in other places, but it's something new to us. So cities evolve, places evolve at different speeds, but essentially, you know, things that happened, evolutionarily speaking, in Madagascar happened in Australia, for example, and the two didn't ever meet. So it's the same with play, I think. My conclusions, my summary for you. Children will often play in places where adults are not. And I think we need to think about that in designing our cities. They will often break the, inverted commas, rules and subvert those rules, but not necessarily to do any great harm or any harm at all. And they will play in edge zones because they're invisible, or they are the road least traveled by the adults. And I think that we need to pay attention to what children are telling us through their play, because we can glean so much than necessarily just this drawing that I've got on the screen, or the direct words that children say to us or write to us. I shall stop there.
Thanks very much, Joel. Well, you've raised lots of issues there, which obviously is exactly what we're we're trying to do, with the Young Citizens Atlas project. See, one of our key concepts was place intelligence. The sort of situated, tacit, and tactical knowledge that we all develop as we interact with the human and non-human environment. And obviously, adults' place intelligence is very different from children's place intelligence, as you've demonstrated. I know pram walkers' place intelligence is different from dog walkers, and certainly for people who are visually impaired or have mobility problems, their tactical knowledge takes its own specific form. And in developing the project, we wanted to make sure that the materials we developed in the toolkit were useful and user-friendly for children and young people with learning difficulties. And that's why I'm delighted that Andy Minion, who's the founder and director of the Rick Centre, has come on board to work with us on this aspect of the project. And he's been working for many years through the Rick Centre, developing software tools and practices for people with learning disabilities. And I think he's going to talk in particular about one particular group that he's been working with. And as I say, we're very much going to be drawing on his experience in developing the modules for the toolkit. So Andy, you're on.
Thanks very much. I'm going to share screen, and in the process, hopefully you'll see yourselves very briefly. And yeah, I'm sharing, but we can bring in the slides. I know I'm showing them. I'm not showing them in slide view. That's because I'm going to play around with them a bit. So just forgive me. Thanks very much for inviting me in, Phil. How inspiring to hear different people's methods and insights around mapping, around engaging people in mapping and engaging people in processes. I liked your intro because it's like I'm here to help broker inclusion of people with a learning disability in the project. I'm going to sort of try and give you a sense of how I might do that. At the moment, that's kind of all I know about my engagement on the project, or the Rick Centre's engagement. But in a way, I'm going to sort of playfully try and use my work with the Purple Stars and the Purple Stars themselves to suggest how that might be. I think the key thing is probably on my last slide, which is this kind of saying that comes from the self-advocacy movement in the US, the "Nothing About Us Without Us" slogan. So yeah, how can we make a youth atlas and a project about youth atlas really inclusive for people with learning disabilities? Well, it's simple. We do it with them, but we know that's not as simple as perhaps as it might sound. I'm being a bit facile. We doing it with them in a way. The one thing that Rick's has done over all these years as a centre that's dedicated to working with people with learning disabilities is try and develop a real methodology that does engage people with a learning disability actively in challenging our practices as software designers and developers, as developers of digital solutions designed for people with learning disabilities. We've had to learn how to include people. The first thing is to employ them as part of the team, which we do, but then that's not enough. We've got to change our practices. And I'm going to give you a little snapshot of how this group that's emerged basically from that approach. We've brought people with learning disabilities into our practices. They've consolidated into a self-identifying group called Purple Stars. And we work with them, and that helps us get things right, I would humbly suggest, in terms of inclusion. And I'm going to show you that. Here they are. This is the first time I met them again after lockdown in a recent visit to the Museum of London. We staged the picture. We weren't really picketing the museum. We were in there running workshops and getting engaged with them, which was really fun. Here's the Purple Stars website. You should go there. I'm going to share the links as well, but within the presentation, and make sure they get distributed. We've worked with lots of sites, and we go in with the Purple Stars and we apply some methods. And but the key method is bringing people with learning disabilities into spaces, into processes. And I think that's very much what I hope to be doing with the Young People's Atlas project, is bringing Purple Stars in to kind of to work with the great practitioners we've just heard, but to work in their processes and to bring their own methods in to see how that can work. I'm going to just jump across to a website. I'm sorry to play a picture of you back there. If I can get myself up and see myself. Yeah, there I am. Good. I'd like myself to be in vision. I'm not quite sure how to achieve that, but I wanted to show you this. Okay, I immediately disappear, but never mind. I'm not important. Let's hear the Purple Stars talk about their approach. This is a video they made to introduce their practices to some people with learning disabilities who are further ed students. Let's see if we can hear them properly.
Hello. My name is Judith. I come from Tampere, and I'm Purple Star Sensory Technology Art Resource Specialist. My name is Matthew. We are going Museum of English Wall of Life. A short to men. We are making museums sensory accessible. What is it? Tight. 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 No. I'm being above. No. TV. Tight. Mike. Elbow. Right. In the museums, there are loads of objects that we cannot touch because we're doing this for objects so that in the museum no one can touch, so to make a replica of the objects that we can touch, and it makes him feel happy.
I think that's lovely. By the way, sorry, the hat is because we're working with the Museum of English Rural Life, and they know what farmers look like, which I thought was a really nice touch. These guys constantly entertain us and with their ideas and their insights and their brilliant methods. It's a real joy working with them. And I'm going to show you what we did, a little sample of what they did with us at the museum. This was actually in, you can see them working with Museum of London. That's recent work we were doing. A little plug there. Check their work out. It's in the Talking Point Gallery in the Museum of London in Barbican until Christmas. There's a whole installation which you must see. But I wanted to show what Judith produced at the Enlightenment Gallery, British Museum. this is a video of it, and again, I'm going to try and clumsily make this.
I'm here to do a full research about the British Museum. So I decided to stay super because it was meant to be where my parents come from. They come from Africa, so when it's like tradition for television, that's what to face a gift. So this mountain, I made it of rubber, so I decided to make it of rubber and then make a smoother version of it so that to the free flow. So I had to make sound music on it. So both so and also inside is a kind of music.
I'll pause it there and just give a little bit of explanation. The box there that Judith is demonstrating is a sensory label. So what the Purple Stars at the did at the British Museum, they wanted to work with the most traditional part of the museum and kind of challenge its inaccessibility. And what they did was they couldn't touch the object, so they made special labels out of boxes, those boxes which we designed with them. And those boxes include a button you can press to hear a sound, something you can slide across to then access a smell, as well as a texture you can feel. And you can see Judith has got the slipper engraved on the side, but also the slipper itself is the trigger for the sound. So you have to actually hold that leather slipper, give it a smell and bend it in order to trigger the sound in the box. So what they've done is they've gone into a very exclusive and what they felt very exclusive and inaccessible part of the museum. They found objects that they related to, and then they created a new curation of those objects by putting together these kind of technical or multimedia objects, a mix of digital tech, of triggers, and of good old wood and pictures, etc. With that multimedia, they reinterpret the gallery, they reinterpret the space. So I'm just going to unpack that. They brought this approach to all the different sites, and the way we do it is we use tools that can stimulate inclusion. On the right, you can see an easy read program for the day. So before we get there, we invite people using language that's easy to read and understand, illustrated with imagery that helps people understand it. So we're helping to engage them properly and make them feel welcome, which is really critical, but also give them the information they need in the most accessible format possible. We took that at RICS into the digital domain and development of our software, and we've created these wikis, which are basically websites. I've got a few here. We have a wiki here that was the basis for the research, the co-research that the guys did, including Judith, around the Enlightenment Gallery. And they go in, use this very easy to assemble, do-it-yourself website. They drop in pictures and they drop in videos that helped capture their thoughts, organize their thoughts and their ideas. And that's what wikis are all about. They hold sounds, pictures.
I couldn't go out anywhere since 6 months lockdown, COVID-19, including gym, meetup peoples.
So you get people being able to add their voices, put together their own accounts of their lives and experiences, and share them with these tools. So those are the two tools involved. And I've just got a couple of minutes to clarify the methods we apply. This slide kind of covers it, so I'll make it full screen. And we're going to apply this to working on the Atlas. Before we crash in on everybody's process and projects, we're going to find out as much as we can by going online and seeing whether there's video or picture or easy language we can grapple with and we can make our own connections with. That's the pre-visit part. We facilitate that, and we usually engage actively with the museums we work with in that process. But sometimes we do it anyway while we're waiting for them to come through with the contract. Then we visit and we do what we call sensory expeditions, where people use cameras, recorders. We've redesigned cameras and recorders to be easier to use and more accessible. They use great big pipettes, which are a bit like kind of bicycle pumps that they use to suck up smells, and then they put those smells in plastic bags and they label them. In practice, we all know you can't smell them afterwards, but the process helps them to map the place, to chart their exploration, and that's the sensory expeditions. Then once we've been there, they get onto those wikis, and we saw a little bit of work that Judith had done. They get onto those wikis, and we do a process where they organize, using multimedia again, their recollections, their thoughts. They put those pictures in, they annotate them, and they come up with their own critique of that place. They highlight what they liked, and then they think about, through artistic practice, creative practice, how they can beef up those things they like and create a new version or added features like those sensory labels to bring to the museum to make the other people with learning disability feel they belong there and feel welcome. Again, sensory technologies are really critical, but also, sensory processes, sensory engagement, because these are the points of access and connectivity that people with intellectual disabilities, and indeed all of us, and particularly children, and other people who might not be able to engage because they're culturally misaligned with the space, engage through. So these are connectivity points of connection that people are able to mobilize. Then they make stuff. We train the curators and the staff at the museum, and we get them really actively involved in understanding what's happening and in building real dialogues with people with learning disabilities, using pictures, videos, and that kind of these sort of easy read methods. Then we have events, which are really crazy, but they're very inclusive and they're driven by people with learning disabilities. They always want music, they want to perform, but they also want to share what they've created, and they want food. And so we put all that together. And again, we kind of disrupt the museums with that, and it's kind of messy and very inspiring for everybody. And they take over. They have a sense of really owning those places. Lastly, they leave those places transformed. And I can say this with real confidence. We go through museums, cultures, and we leave them disrupted. And they make changes, so it doesn't always work fully. I must say the British Museum was perhaps less responsive than the Museum of London, and certainly actually Museum of English Rural Life was fantastic. There's a life-size cow there, to which you can add your own moo now, very popular. But there's also a quad bike that we bought in with a full face helmet you can put on, which provides a virtual reality view of a farmer on Dartmoor rounding up the sheep. And people with learning disabilities are employed by the Museum of English Rural Life to demonstrate that on a day-to-day basis now. So not only did they go in, re-curate the space, they also imposed their presence there and got invited in. Their expertise was recognised, and they are now there as part of the museum's inclusion policy as staff who help other people share the experiences that they've created. So that's what we're going to do with the little snapshot there, the processes we're going to use, and how we're going to bring people with learning disability right into the heart of the Youth Atlas process. We're not just going to check your materials out or check our colleagues' materials out to make sure they're a little bit inclusive at the end. We're going to bring people with learning disabilities into the whole processes of the project. And I know we'll be welcomed. I've met the people today. I've worked with Phil previously. I know that process will be welcomed, but I also know we'll have a bumpy ride and it will be messy. But I think this is the approach we use for developing software at the RICS Centre, and we've got a bit of a rep for it. But now it's the approach we're using to challenge these spaces, in our case, museums, that don't include us all. We're going to bring the whole process to work with cities and see how we can change cities to include people more effectively. So I hope that ignites your interest and that it sounds like a good way to approach things. It's just a methodology that I've devised with my colleague Kate Allen from Reading University, who's a sensory artist, but above all, with those guys who you've just met on video and in those pictures, people with learning disabilities who can teach us stuff. You know what I mean? I'll stop now.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Andy. Well, you can see why we wanted Andy and the Purple Stars on board this project. And in fact, I mean, our idea of maps is anyway, what we want to encourage is young people, children and young people, to make multimedia maps. So it's not just about them using photography and storytelling and interviews and drawing and so on, but you know, as Andy's been showing us, sensory maps, sound and touch and smell. And actually, there are a number of responses in the chat actually relating to Joel's presentation, which raised that issue as well. So,
if I could just say, I really strongly saw those links straight away with the images, those pictures you were sharing, Joel, and the way they were being described, and similarly, Giada's toolkit, using very similar processes. So I'm very excited about the way our methods and tools will work with yours, you know, work with the rest of the team. Thank you.
Definitely strong synergy there. Well, at the same time, I suppose the broadest frame of the project, I mean, what it's focused, all the threads coming together in the last module, which is called Our Kind of Town, and which really is about exploring and trying to make much more sort of concrete the notion of a child-friendly city, and particularly how that applies to groups that are marginalized. So I'm delighted that Kelda Lyons can join us to complete the presentations. Kelda works across fields of children's play and inclusive built environments and design. She's very interested in environmental design. And she's going to be talking to us about the importance of mapping and how it can, to take Andy's word, beef up the notion of the child-friendly city. So, Kelda.
Thanks, Phil. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hang on a moment. Okay, can you all see our presentation on the screen?
Yes.
Yes, thanks. So yeah, hi everyone, I'm Kelda. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see you all here. I'm going to talk in quite general terms about child-friendly cities and mapping with children and young people. And talk about the importance of mapping with marginalized children and young people. So I'm going to talk about the notion of the child-friendly city. I'll discuss some policy, publications, toolkits, and then I'll talk about the importance of mapping with children, teenagers, and marginalized subgroups. Not a great phrase, but yeah, I'll explain that in a moment. I'm going to give some examples of research and mapping that's sort of relevant to the project, and I'll put links to everything at the end, so don't worry about catching those as you go along. I'll put them all in the chat.
Sorry, Kelda, for interrupting you. We see the presentation only in the half of our screen, so probably you can. Yes, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, it's jumped around when I turn the screen on. Thank you. Okay, just a mention of terminology of using the term marginalized. This is just, I mean, Andy's just talked about some of this already, but this is just recognizing the fact that children are not all the same. They're not a homogeneous group. I'm going to mention girls and disabled children in this presentation, but there's obviously sort of other, you know, groups of people who get marginalized, and it's, you know, anyone who gets marginalized sort of by the actions of society, and it can be in any particular place at any particular time. And when I refer to children and young people, it's sort of any age children up to young adults. Okay. So the idea of the child-friendly city is sort of gaining traction in the fields of architecture, public health, town planning, local and national governance, and others. And on this slide, I'm just going to talk about a few examples of work that sort of aim to achieve child-friendly cities. And there are many other fantastic publications and programs that exist. There's loads of great stuff happening, but this is just a few of them. So on the left, where the sign says, the photo with the sign that says road closed, this is from the Playing Out website. Playing Out was a parent-led action where two parents closed their residential street, using the council permission to run a street party, and they hosted a play street instead where children can come out and play. This is now expanded, and there's a play streets program website with advice on how to run your own play street, and they're happening all over the country. The yellow document that says Hackney in big letters is it's called Growing Up in Hackney, and it's a local authority town planning document. It's a policy document, and it stipulates what built environment developments need to do to make built environment and places child friendly. The next document, Making London Child Friendly. So this is part of the Mayor of London's, it's called Good Growth by Design programme. And the document sets out how policy, participation, design and management can support children's play and leisure, independent mobility. And the document really discusses independent mobility and how this is key for creating child-friendly cities. The premise being that if you can't get around, you can't access where you live. So that's really important. The document on the bottom right is the Unicef Child-Friendly Cities Programme, and that provides a development model that's used by cities and boroughs as well, and it's used internationally. On the top right, this is a toolkit. It's called Voice, Opportunity, Power, and it's a consultation toolkit that's designed by ZCD Architects, and it provides guidance for adults on how to conduct youth engagement and consultation with 11 to 18-year-olds, and this is to inform built environment development. So yeah, these are just a few examples of where child-friendly city principles are held. And you can see how they move from like the local to the international. Next slide. I'm going to talk through some of the principles that are contained in these documents and other ones. So the child-friendly city, really important thing to say is it's not about more playgrounds and more kind of fenced places where children and young people can go. It's about children's right to space, leisure, play, and their ability to influence decision-making about the things that affect them and their participation in public life. So it's about equitable use of public space. It's about places to play and places to be. I mentioned independent mobility before. The planning policy document talks about sort of doorstep play, on the way, and destinations. So you can really see how it's not just about going to a playground or a sports centre or so on. And the Making London Child Friendly document mentions places and streets. So it's thinking in these terms. What are the proposals? You know, what do they suggest? They talk about things like wide pavements, safe walking, cycling, scooting routes, low pollution levels, places to play or be near your home, and space for informal physical activity for teenagers. So these are just some of the suggestions. Here's an example. This is called the Barcelona Superblocks initiative. So on the bottom left, there's a photo which shows how some of Barcelona is kind of set out in this grid system. And the spaces sort of in between the corners of the blocks, lots of them have had cars banned or restricted from the, going in the spaces. Priority has been given to walking and cycling, and open space has been reclaimed from parking. And what they've ended up with is what we see here in these pictures. So these are spaces, they're playable, but they're not, you know, fixed equipment playgrounds. They can be used for different things by different people at different points in time. And they're sort of child friendly by the nature of the policy, design, management, and they provide community space for people of all ages. You can see the bottom photo that has a play focus, but it can also be used for other things at other times. So I roller skate, so that's somewhere I would go and skate as long as I'm not going to be in the way of children. So I might go, I don't know, yeah, times when they're not using it, or go around the edge or so on. Yeah. Okay, next slide. I'm time conscious. This was a GIF. It stopped moving in my PDF, but it still does the job, which is, this is Amsterdam, and it shows where playgrounds are located, and there's lots of playgrounds near children's homes. So what does it tell us? What could it tell us? It can tell us that children and play spaces are prioritised across the city. Space for children to play and be is achievable in many areas, but a lot of Berlin is similar to this. And without criticising that map, which is a great map and really useful, what doesn't it tell us? It doesn't tell us whether we've got, you know, the thing on the left or the thing on the right. It doesn't tell us about the quality of the places. The one on the right is the playground in the Olympic Park in East London. So yeah, it doesn't tell us who uses the places, playgrounds, who doesn't, when does everyone feel comfortable there? Do the spaces work for children with disabilities or not? So desktop mapping studies, they don't tell us about experience, perception, feelings of safety, which are things that can encourage or prevent use of places. So we've got all these principles, documents on child-friendly cities, you know, all great, useful stuff. So why map with children and young people when we have this guidance? So children have a right to participation and decision-making. And if we don't gather information and wisdom from them, like some of the accounts that Jill just shared were, you know, they had quite an impact on me, probably did on some of you as well, the tree hugging and so on. So if we don't gather information from them, how do we make informed decisions about designing and managing places? And the documents I showed earlier, and other ones as well, they all recommend local mapping and place-based consultation with young people. I'm going to look at this a bit further by discussing a research commission, a study of sports cages, and a campaign organisation that have done place-based mapping and research with young people. So the first one on the top left is Hackney Young Futures Commission. So Hackney is a borough in East London, and the commission was set up to ask young people how they view Hackney as a place to live and the changes they want to see. So it included looking at things like education, services, spaces, places, facilities. And it was started in 2019. It was done with young people aged 10 to 25 years old, and over 2,400 people participated. There's a report produced in 2020. I'm not going to share all the outcomes because you can read the report on their website, but I've mentioned this commission because I think it's important, because it asks young people about a range of factors within their lives: education, facilities, places, and it recognised how these things relate to each other and how they combine to affect young people's lives. Also, the level of participation was higher than they originally aimed for. And it shows that young people want to be heard. It's important for them. It gave them a place to talk about what they value, and it shows that they have positive, constructive things to say about where they live. It shows that more wide-ranging consultations can be done with young people on this scale if it's invested in and managed properly. So it's just a really great example of research. Yeah, go and check their website, links at the end. On the right, bottom right, we've got what's called Bunga, or multi-use games area, or a sports cage. I'll use the term sports cage. And the top is the front page of a report by a youth worker called Luke Billingham. So he mapped sports cages in Hackney, again in East London. And the report's entitled Sports Cages, Places of Safety, Places of Harm, Places of Potential. And the report explores the value and potential of cages for young people and whole communities. And it looks in the context of child-friendly cities and safeguarding advantages and challenges. It looked at things like locations, types of use, or so formal sessions or informal use, flooring, entrances, lighting, maintenance. And I'm talking about it here because I think it's really significant, because it offers a very detailed picture of how one type of youth space provision works across a borough, what the cages offer, how they're perceived and used by young people. And I think it's really useful for understanding the very rich detail of places that young people use and the implications that design and management have for young people. And it shows how it's possible to explore the nuances of young people's spaces in such great detail, and that we can't just think in terms of spaces for teenagers. What we provide for which youth really matters. We have to be doing the right things in the right places. On the left, bottom left, is the name of a campaign, Make Space for Girls. They campaign for facilities and public spaces for teenage girls. So they highlight how girls are designed out of public places, and they've got case studies and consultation tools on their website. They recently wrote about a Friends of Park group in York in England. And this is where local residents are involved in sort of running their local park. And the group was inspired by Make Space for Girls to do research with older local girls and boys to find out about how girls use and don't use the park. And they looked at a skate park with girls aged 10 to 17. And initial feedback from girls, some was 90% of girls who are into skating don't feel comfortable there in the skate park. 94% who go to the skate park or have been said they don't feel others there, which is all the boys in the skate park. They don't feel others there are encouraging to them. So they just don't feel welcome in this place. And in plenty of UK parks, the only kind of physical activity provision for older children are teenagers, are skate parks and sports facilities. And this kind of raises other questions. So without setting limits on ideas about what disabled people can and can't do, it's worth asking, how disability accessible and therefore inclusive is it just having a skate park? So these are some examples of why we need to think about different groups of children and consult different groups of children and consider those who might be more marginalized. I've got my own reflections on the examples. So there's a line of thinking that if we don't design people in, if we don't design all children and all young people in, we just end up designing them out by default or by accident, because we didn't go and listen and work out what they really needed. And some of these reports discuss how place design and management is important. So I think that's something we should look at when doing place mapping with young people. And all these examples ask what's relevant for young people in this place now. COVID's obviously been mentioned already, but understanding what young people need out of public places during COVID and coming out of it is important. So ongoing place mapping research can really contribute to this understanding. And I think that understanding local children's cultures is important. And just realizing children do have their own cultures, they differ from place to place. I've got a couple of examples. One is one London borough that I've worked in a lot with children. Music, singing, dancing, rapping. It was really important in every setting I worked in this borough, and I've worked in quite a few. So children always wanted space, encouragement, permission, skilled staff, and facilities to do these things and to support them doing these things. In another borough I've worked in London, we were near Arsenal Football Club, and playing football was hugely important, and having a connection and a relationship to Arsenal somehow was important. And I don't want to say that these things define any child, or children in this borough are only interested in football or dancing. You know, everyone's different, but it's just examples of how what's important to young people can really differ from place to place. And we've got all these principles. You know, like I said, all the principles and the suggestions there, I think most of them are fantastic, but they can't always deal with very local character and culture and address all the needs of marginalized groups. And if you look at play design documents that give advice for designing play areas for disabled children, they normally prioritize local consultation as well as giving design advice. There's very few that just say, this is what you need to design. They will emphasize, here's good ways to approach design, but you also need to ask the people who are going to use them. So I would leave it there. I'll add links in the chat in a moment. And thank you. That's Livingmaps at the top. That's me at the bottom. Feel free to get in touch if you'd like to talk about any of this.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kelda.
Welcome.
We had a full program, and we've, you know, but I think we need to have some time for discussion. So I mean, we're going to run over time, but I mean, so what? There's been quite a lot of contributions to the chat, but just following up. I mean, Julia Morlacci, you've made two very interesting comments. I don't know if are you still with us? If so, I don't know.
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Good. All right. Well, you raised an issue about you've been doing some research around mapping, planning, and child-friendly cities and so on. So, do you want to pitch in and make a comment, or?
Sure, I can. Kelda was spot on when she mentioned about children needing to be consulted and involved in planning, be it with the city or their own play spaces. Just in my own research, I did a comparative analysis of 5 different, we'll call them organizations, basically, of people who work directly with children with built environment education. And there's basically the same finding that they have all stated that, or most of them have stated that children need to be involved in real projects because you continue to empower them, you teach them for the future. But if it's just an exercise in design or just for fun, you're still educating them, but you kind of fail them because you're not continuing on with the process. So they don't take ownership that, hey, I designed this play space in my schoolyard or my park, and I said, I'd like a tree or with a swing or something. They take ownership when they see their own project realized or something they're involved in. So that was just my big comment that, yeah, Kelda was spot on. And we're seeing some of that happening around the world, but it's still kind of slow. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Tim Gill, you made an interesting, you've written a book about urban playgrounds. So are you there? Something you want to tell us about? You referenced Dinah Bornat, and we've been in discussion with her, and she's going to be one of our consultants on the project, actually. So anyway, Tim, are you there?
He left. He said bye in the chat, so I think he left.
Oh, he left. Okay, well, he's raised some. I don't personally know his book about urban playground. Maybe Joel or Kelda know about it.
I'll put the link in the chat.
Yeah. Oh, good.
I don't know that book directly, but I know of Tim's previous writings on risk and so forth. That's not his only thing, but he's obviously keen to promote children's rights in terms of sort of things that we're talking about as well.
Well, it's very good to draw on these different countries. I mean, we've heard a bit about Barcelona, and obviously Boulder, Colorado also seemed interesting. So, obviously, work is happening in different places, taking account of different political situations and different issues. But yes, I mean, obviously, Young Citizens Atlas is part of a kind of broader movement, really, to try and change the relations of knowledge and power that currently exist and exclude children and young people from a whole area of public debate, deliberation, decision making, and so on. Is there anybody who hasn't maybe put something in the chat but has got something that they want to share with us? I'm just Laura. You lived in Manchester and you're from Barcelona. Is there something you want to say about these Superblocks?
Well, I really just follow the Superblocks from a distance because I follow the news and all that. But I was listening recently to an interview, and maybe something to be suspicious about because it was a member of the opposition in the city hall. So not the group that has promoted the Superblocks, but there seems to be quite a bit of concern raised on the fact that the places where the Superblocks appear, the real estate is increasing price. And this is a huge problem at the moment in Barcelona, that a lot of real estate is being appropriated by foreign investment and creating apartments for tourists. So a lot of people who have grew up in Barcelona, it's impossible for them to buy a house. So the initiatives like the Superblocks, which makes me think that there is so many things that affect the issues that we are talking about, right? That are kind of entangled in many questions of power and space in the cities. Like obviously we are focusing here in privileging the children perspectives, but I think it's important not to lose this perspective of how a space is entangled with other processes like dispossession, marginalization, displacement, erasure, and some things that seem quite benign with these Superblocks, which I visit them and they are fantastic. they have some other things that maybe they are not so benign, because at the end the children that have to be playing in these Superblocks will be displaced, and it will be the children of tourists visiting Barcelona playing in the Superblocks. So it was just I think it's an interesting case to keep looking at. And obviously every city has its own politics. At this moment, I'm in Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'm trying to start a project on Black spaces around the neighborhoods of Hulme and Mosai that are historical gateways of the Afro-Caribbean migration, but they have been also in the last 30 years highly reurbanized, and they are presented as neighborhoods that are dominated by Manchester Met and Manchester University, because they are also in these neighborhoods, and they have all this narrative of access, creativity, but it's not for the youth of these neighborhoods. The youth. I've been interested in how, for example, if you look at something like Google Maps, it presents the space in accordance to that narrative for the young people that come to Manchester, to these two big institutions. But Google Maps presents like that Black presence is not at all present in the space. It is materially present, but I'm also really interested in how powerful these tools are to dispossess, to really make that narrative of access and all that transparent. So I'm really interested in looking also in starting navigating the space with maps from the past. So I've been working with a cartographer from Manchester University, and I'm starting to use ordinance maps from the past. And I want to think with young people and navigate the space with these maps, which is going to be quite disorienting. I still have not done the field experience, but you have in those maps, you still have a presence that it doesn't appear present in the available maps. And move to the space, do some films. It's been difficult for me starting the project by myself. I got the money in the middle of lockdown, and I have had a lot of difficulties engaging young people, but I think we'll be able to do some work after January and into the summer. So I'll keep in touch with the group if you're interested. And
please do. I wearing my other hat as one of the editorial team of Livingmaps Review. We'd love to. It's a sort of, the section of the journal, the online journal, where we get people to talk about their work in progress. So it doesn't have to be some finished piece. But also, what you're doing, it obviously has a lot of synergy with what we're trying to do here. I should say that we're heading out towards a pilot project in London, and we're certainly interested in talking to any teachers or youth workers in London schools or youth centres who'd like to be part of that. But I think the ultimate ambition is to roll it out. It wouldn't just be confined to London. It started out as being about London and the changes happening to London's planning and so on. But actually, as it's evolved, it's a much more online project. And the idea is that the map works the children, young people make are uploaded into a dedicated space on our website, but also have local exhibitions. And then after the pilot, when we've tested the different modules, and modified them and so on, the light of the experience of working in different environments, to kind of roll it out nationally, because it could be available for teachers and youth workers to download, wherever they are. So it's not just confined to London. So that's very interesting. The issues you're raising there are certainly ones that we're having to address as well. So please do get in touch. Actually, I put my email in the
I've been collecting all the emails.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I don't know about you lot, but I'm a bit flagged out now. So I think, I just thank everybody that's, made the contributions this evening. And I really, I've learned a lot. I mean, I know we're working with people, but, getting people together in the same time and space is not always easy. And I think this is taken us on a stage in developing this project. So thanks to everybody really for their input, and for everybody who's attended as well. And I can see from the chat that people have got a lot from it. So thank you all very, very much. And finally, just say we have our next event is a more formal occasion. I suppose it's a lecture. Every year we have this William Bunga Memorial Lecture. William Bunga was this rather amazing radical geographer that kind of inspired us when we got started. And this year's lecture has been given by Candace Fujikane, who's written this amazing book called Mapping for Abundance. And her argument is that native economies of abundance are the best foundation for working against climate change. And so she's from Hawaii, and she's going to be talking about her developing her argument, but drawing on her own environmental activism. So that'll be on November the 17th. So I look forward to seeing you then. And thank you again, once again, for coming tonight. Okay.
Thank you.
Saying bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.